There we go. All right. Now we can do the stream. I did not want to talk for a fucking hour to myself again. All right. So like I said, we're just going to be going through a bunch of interesting articles, looking up the history behind some of the events going on today, and just trying to have fun, man, trying to get educated. So let's do this. So our first article is about all of the crazy stuff happening in Brazil. Jair Bolsonaro has been kind of fucking with the institutions ever since he got into office. Of course, he's a terrible president, or whatever they call it in Brazil. And, he's been responsible for the rainforest getting completely destroyed for the sake of private profits. He's kind of laid the groundwork for deeper militarization in Brazil. So we're going to read all about that, and we're going to try to go deeper into the history of why this is happening and how the U.S. kind of laid the groundwork for this kind of political maneuvering and operations in Brazil and Latin America in the wider context. So let's get right into it. So this article is from Jacobin by Olavo Passos de Souza and Mikhail Wolf. Jair Bolsonaro is laying the groundwork for a coup in Brazil. On October 2nd, more than 200 million Brazilians will elect their next president. Most voters will likely choose between two of Brazil's best-known politicians, current President Jair Messias Bolsonaro, who is struggling for re-election after 4 tumultuous years, and former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva of the left-wing Workers' Party, who is aiming for an unprecedented and non-consecutive third term. And this part of the article just kind of delves into the background that, like I said, leads up to where we are right now in Brazil regarding the elections. So, in 1889, after slavery was abolished, the agrarian elite withdrew its support for the monarchy and allied with a disgruntled military to stage a coup that removed the Emperor Pedro II. This agrarian military alliance established an oligarchic republic which they subsequently dominated to protect their interest. This first republic was in turn toppled by the Revolution of 1930, in which the urban middle class allied with disgruntled military officers led by Getulio Vargas to wrest power from the agrarian elite. President Vargas's authoritarian government was responsible for some progressive social reforms. Then in 1937, Vargas launched a self-coup to reinforce his grip on the country by imposing an anti-communist corporatist dictatorship, before he himself was ousted from power in 1945 by a growing democratic opposition. And if you look through history, a lot of similar events were happening around that time. That's when communism and socialism really started to enter the global zeitgeist, as well as industrialization just kind of really taking a grip on the world and devastating some of those countries that were left behind and exploited by first world countries. So let's continue. 20 years of unstable democratic rule followed until in 1964, left-wing President João Goulart came under fire from the conservative elite that opposed his radical social reforms. Goulart's increase of the minimum wage, expansion of labor rights, and plans for an agrarian reform, their first one in the country's history, were more than enough to bring the elite and the military together to stage a US-backed coup promoted as a defense against communism. The bloody dictatorship that held power from 1964 to 1985 tortured and murdered left-wing dissidents and massively increased the national debt. While doing so, it deflected from its crimes through the use of nationalistic rhetoric that Bolsonaro perpetuates, as we shall see. And we definitely shall see. It is truly history repeating itself all across the globe at the moment. I wanted to bring up this article here. Just give me one moment. There we go. Yep. So this article is titled "The U.S. Role in the 1964 Coup in Brazil: A Reassessment" by Anthony W. Pereira, who is with King's College in London. So this article really does a good job of breaking down why the U.S. got involved in Latin America and why this is relevant to what's going on today. Or I should say, it helps us understand why this is relevant to what's going on today. So let's take a look. And we're only going to be looking at the highlighted sections. But I highly suggest you read through all of this yourself to get a really good understanding of the history of coups and government corruption in Brazil, as well as the US's capitalist, imperialistic kind of dominance of Latin America, especially during the 1950s, 60s, all the way really up to the late 70s, early 80s. The economic interests of imperialistic U.S. corporations made the U.S. government's opposition to Goulart inevitable. Neto argues that the U.S. turned definitively against Goulart in early 1962 because of the Brazilian position in the Organization of American States, Punta del Este meeting in January of that year, refusing to completely endorse the U.S. position on Cuba. Now, if you're brand new to politics, Cuba had their revolution, I believe it was in... I think it was in 1959. The U.S. tried to invade in the Bay of Pigs. They failed spectacularly. So Cuba kind of became the U.S.'s pariah state, and they imposed a bunch of illegal sanctions and just tried to punish them basically for not bowing to U.S. hegemony. The U.S. was engaged in a process of preventative counter-revolution on a world scale that made a clash with Goulart inevitable. He traces the events of 1964 to a meeting in the White House on the 30th of July, 1962, which definitively opened the road to the coup in Brazil. Tavares sees U.S. Ambassador to Brazil Lincoln Gordon as a key figure in devising and implementing U.S. policy, and believes that all aspects of that policy, even the deployment of the Peace Corps, were directed towards the removal of Goulart. And that's usually always the case whenever the U.S. or some other imperialistic force or first world country tries to go in and quote-unquote help these developing nations. It's almost always just to steal natural resources and get them under the thumb of whatever country is trying to do the bullying. So this section right here that we're going to be reading a snippet from is Politics in the USA After World War II. This stuff is still relevant to this day. We're kind of still watching this kind of arc of global geopolitics play out around the world. Overall, changes in the United States in the 1950s and early 1960s made it less likely that there could be peaceful relations between governments of the left or center left in Latin America and the U.S. government. The intensification of the Cold War, U.S. paranoia about communism, and the dribbling away of the New Deal progressivism of the 1930s and 1940s in U.S. domestic politics made such a rapprochement difficult. Instead, a national security state, high defense spending, and militarization and social conformism were characteristics of the United States in this period. Hans Morgenthau, the father of classical realism and the author of the influential Politics Among Nations, first published in 1948, argued that the United States was more powerful, but also more vulnerable after World War II. He thought that the American tradition in foreign policy, at least until the Spanish-American War, had been anti-imperialist and legalistic. Yeah, right. Trail of Tears, taking over an entire fucking country from their native population. Okay. But this was made in 1950 when everyone was fucking hopped up on McCarthyism, so I'll let it slide, I guess. He argued that the U.S. had to abandon this tradition and adopt a new perspective appropriate to its new power. In a striking passage, he writes, "From the end of the Civil War to the beginning of the Second World War, it mattered little what policies the United States pursued with regard to its Latin American neighbors, China, or Spain. The self-sufficiency of its own strength, in conjunction with the operation of the balance of power, made the United States immune to the boundless ambition born of success and the fear of frustration which goes with failure. The United States could take success and failure in stride without being unduly tempted or afraid. Now it stands outside the enclosures of its continental citadel, taking on the whole of the political world as friend or foe. It has become dangerous and vulnerable, feared and afraid. The risk of being very powerful, but not omnipotent, is aggravated by a second fact, a dual revolution in the political situation of the world. The multiple state system of the past, which in the moral sense was one world, has been transformed into two inflexible, hostile blocks, which are morally two worlds. So, I mean, basically what he's saying here is after World War II, the U.S. was in a position of global dominance. The powers in Europe were devastated. The old world superpowers were devastated by the war. Obviously, Nazi Germany was completely obliterated and basically not even a country anymore. Japan was all fucked up and occupied by the U.S. So they were basically the only capitalist country to not have major devastation within their own borders. And on top of that, the United States is a very valuable geopolitical resource. There's a lot of land that's farmable. There's a lot of natural resources and gas. So it put the United States in the position to kind of take over and be the dominant force. And you'll see a pattern throughout history that once a nation becomes sort of an imperial power, the paranoia and the fear of that power being taken away and collapsing is always there. And now in the context of this new world order, which he's describing with the two hostile blocks, you had the United States and Europe, who were capitalists and industrialists, and you had the bloc, which back then in the 40s, 50s, basically all the way up until the collapse of the Soviet Union, the major bloc was the USSR and its sphere of influence, as well as China, but China was still kind of developing and dealing with its own severe problems at that time. So you have this huge industrial capitalist nation who wants to keep its dominance. So they began this kind of campaign of anti-leftism, anti-communism, and brutal exploitation and coercion around the world. And that all really started in Latin America. In this new Cold War environment, according to Morgan, therefore, not to be judged in purely economic terms. According to Morgenthau, the U.S. had to be prepared to defend its national interests pragmatically and unequivocally in Latin America. The totalitarian menace was supposedly so great that it required the managers of the U.S. state to abandon conventional morality in order to combat it, straight out of the fascist playbook, where they perceive an enemy that is so great and so immoral that our own governments and military's immorality is quote-unquote justified. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, the totalitarian model developed by political scientists such as Carl Friedrich was used to justify hardline positions against communism and hints of communism. According to this view, once a country went communist, it was impossible to ever restore capitalism and liberal democracy to it. In the words of Elliot Abrams, the architect of policies against the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua in the 1980s, if communism was a disease whose existence could not be prevented, it was one whose spread was controllable. Therefore, a global system of quarantine or containment was necessary. After the passage of the 1947 National Security Act and the X article by realist diplomat George Kennan in the same year, containment became a linchpin of U.S. foreign policy. In this perspective, Latin America was of vital strategic importance because it contained raw materials, that's a key word, raw materials that were of economic and military value to the U.S., and Latin American votes in the United Nations gave the U.S. political support. In addition, Latin America would be the last area the U.S. could rely on if Europe became anti-American. According to Kennan, it was important to prevent Latin America from being militarily exploited by the USSR or mobilized against the U.S. Writing in 1950, Kennan declared the security had to come first in U.S. policy toward Latin America. The final answer might be an unpleasant one, he wrote, but we should not hesitate before police repression by the local government. This is not shameful, since the communists are essentially traitors. It is better to have a strong regime in power than a liberal government if it is indulgent and relaxed and penetrated by communists. Now, something I didn't know, but I learned through reading this article, is that Kennedy was extremely anti-left. Like, he orchestrated the U.S.'s involvement with the overthrow of Brazil, and he had conversations that were secretly recorded that showed his stance against leftism and communism. I mean, he was really just a product of his time. The, like I said, severe anti-communism and socialism brought on by McCarthyism, where people were terrified of the USSR and of the Soviet bloc, and they had all kinds of propaganda put out painting them as basically the leftist version of Nazis, which is obviously ridiculous. I mean, Stalinism was authoritarian and it was terrible, but you have to look at the context of the USSR as a whole when Lenin was in power and after Stalin died and Gorbachev took power. And unfortunately, you know, Stalin kind of left a mark on Russia that continues to this day in terms of authoritarianism, but it wasn't all bad. And at some points during the USSR's reign in Russia and the Soviet bloc, they actually had a higher standard of living in Russia compared to the United States. The two key mechanisms of containment were economic aid to allied regimes and political parties on one hand, and support for regime overthrow in the case of recalcitrant or overly relaxed and indulgent governments. In Latin America, an example of the use of the first mechanism is U.S. policy to Bolivia after the revolution there in 1952. The U.S. reacted in a moderate fashion to the revolution, offering economic assistance to the new government and attempting to remove Bolivia, and attempting to move Bolivia in a conservative direction. The policy was considered a great success inside the U.S. government. In the words of Zunez, the National Security Council saw the successful handling of the Bolivian situation as a model, and it was one that would be exploited to the fullest in Latin America and elsewhere. Now, if you want a great book that kind of delves into the devastation of Latin America and the introduction of neoliberal economics and government organizing in Latin America and how brutal and disgusting the U.S. military and CIA treated Latin America during the 1950s up to around the mid-1970s, the Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein is a great place to start. I'm sure some of you guys have heard about the book before, but it really gets into the nitty-gritty and how the Chicago-style school of economics kind of was exported all around the globe with devastating results, and how MK Ultra kind of influenced the way in which the Chicago School of Neoliberal Economics was implemented over there as a kind of shock therapy, where they would go in and devastate the country economically and militarily so that the people would kind of be in a daze, so that they wouldn't really realize the kind of shift of power and the shift of resources being taken away from the people and being put into the hands of corporations, U.S. corporations most of the time, as well as private local corporations for the sake of capital gain. So now we kind of have a background into the history of violent overthrow in Latin America and the U.S.'s attitude towards that. And I kind of think that their attitude is kind of like impermeated into the space of Latin American politics, where bad actors within the political sphere kind of use the United States tactics to their advantage. They've adopted that kind of shock doctrine to further exploit the countries where they have power. So let's get back in the article with that in mind. So now in the article, it gives us a little bit of background to Lula and why Bolsonaro kind of sees him as a threat now. Lula's first term as president from 2002 to 2010 saw the development of social programs in partnership with the private sector that quickly returned the economy to sustained 4% annual growth levels after years of neoliberal crisis. Programs like Bolsa Familia, which established a universal basic income for families living below the poverty line, and Fome Zero, Zero Hunger, proved highly successful in combating poverty and improving education. Economically, Lula's government was aided by high commodity prices, which enabled it to make large investments in sectors such as energy and infrastructure. However, all was not roses in Lula's government. In 2005, a large-scale bribery scandal broke in Congress. Dubbed Mensalao, monthly payment, the scandal involved buying votes for federal programs with public money. The largest of its kind until then, the Mensalao controversy damaged the PT's image as being outside Brazil's notoriously corrupt governing system. Nevertheless, by the time Lula left office, his personal approval rating had reached a record high of 87%. If you're not sure what PT is, by the way, it's like it's like Brazil's Labor Party, or more left-leaning populist party. And we're not going to really get into Dilma Rousseff. It's not super important. She was put in after Lula came into power, or, elected. I'm pretty sure she was elected. I got to read more into it. But anyway, Dilma Rousseff was decidedly less pragmatic than Lula. Dilma became more isolated as she refused to go along with the patronage politics of PT allied parties. So you'll see that as a trend a lot in countries, not in the US because all we have are fucking right-wing parties, but you see that as a trend nowadays, like especially in places like the UK. It's a great kind of comparison where labor parties more and more are kind of getting absorbed and neutered by the more neoliberal parties, not the right parties, but more of the center-right parties. You know what I mean? And I think it's important to always remember that the only way we're really going to get political and economic change for the people is to have our labor force organize. Because the way that it works in our system of capitalism is that money is power. So the people, the sociopaths, the psychopaths who do whatever it takes to get that money and power usually have the broader resources and say over the government, and the only way to combat that is through a strong labor movement. By 2015, with a full-blown economic recession underway, the Brazilian Congress, then mostly opposed to Rousseff, pounced on what was dubbed fiscal peddling. This was a new term meant to describe the use of state-owned banks by one branch of the federal government to front funds required for paying general government obligations without officially declaring a loan. Though it had long been a common fiscal practice, Congress now labeled such measures unauthorized loans that were not only economically irresponsible, but also constituted an impeachable offense. Rousseff's subsequent removal appeared to be a coup in all but name, as her successor, the conservative Vice President Michael Temer, moved quickly to undo many of the PT's most successful social policies without an electoral mandate. And that's also a trend you'll see with right-wingers in any nation, is that they have a lot more willingness to bend the institutions to politically assassinate and remove their opposition. So basically, Rousseff and members of her cabinet and parts of Congress who were on their side and in the PT party were getting loans from state banks to pay for government operations. And the Brazilian government had been doing that for a long time. It's probably economically irresponsible, but not illegal. But when it suited the right-wing party's interests, they just declared it irresponsible and illegal to push out the more left-leaning parties, especially because Rousseff was less willing to bend to their demands than Lula, who over the years has become a lot more centrist and willing to work with the centrist and center-right to get at least some of his programs through. Alrighty. At the same time, Operation Car Wash, a federal operation authorized by the conservative magistrate Sergio Moro, carried out an extensive investigation of government corruption. It led to the arrest of numerous politicians, almost all on the left, even though right-wing politicians, including Temer, were also mired in corruption scandals. Indeed, Operation Car Wash's principal target was Lula himself, who was arrested and charged almost in tandem with Rousseff's impeachment. There was scant evidence of wrongdoing in Lula's case, with the chief prosecutor noting that we don't have the evidence, but we have conviction of his guilt. That is rich. We don't have anything that shows that he's guilty, but we think he's guilty, so throw him in jail anyway. Leaked messages offered strong evidence of blatant political bias on the part of Moro and his colleagues. This convinced many Brazilians that Operation Car Wash was little more than a purge of the left, which it totally was. Come on, you have a conservative operation to literally just purge the government of the left. That's exactly what it is, because Lula was getting in programs that actually helped people out and didn't just give away money to corporations, which is what the right-wingers love. Don't let them tell you anything different. All around the world, right-wing parties are solely for corporations and corporate globalization. That's it. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. By impeaching Rousseff, imprisoning Lula on trumped-up charges, and sweeping the PT's impressive accomplishments under the rug while singling the party out as a den of corruption, the conservative reaction of the mid-2010s helped pave way for far-right fringe politician Jair Bolsonaro to be elected president. It's all manufacturing consent, man. The right, unfortunately, is a lot better at playing the political game a lot of the time because they're more willing to bend the rules and bend the truth to fit their narrative. So, of course, for the average person who isn't super involved in politics and is just trying to get through life, they see on the news Lula and a bunch of the left is being arrested for corruption and fucking you over, regardless of whether it's true or not. You're going to have a percentage of the population that just takes that at face value and is turned off from the left. So, I mean, that strategy has been played out so many times. And if you were here for the article we just went through, kind of detailing the CIA's involvement in these countries, you'll see that these governments in Latin America and Brazil specifically are taking it right out of the CIA's playbook of divide and conquer. The former low-ranking army officer, and this is talking about Jair Bolsonaro now, the former low-ranking army officer turned politician made his career as a far-right polemicist. He had whitewashed the history of the military dictatorship, called for the arrest and torture of leftists, expressed hostility to protecting the environment, especially the Amazon rainforest, much of which has been destroyed, and otherwise embraced every conceivable reactionary talking point. The global trend of the 2010s of increased polarization as mainstream conservative politicians lost ground to reactionaries, combined with a severe economic crisis to create the perfect conditions for Bolsonaro's unlikely rise. And we're seeing that rise all around the world, man. The world is more unstable. Economically, people are getting screwed. Energy around the world is getting harder to procure, and it's getting way more expensive, which we're going to get to an article that is just absolutely fucking insane about that later on. But the more people suffer without there being a strong left to give them an alternative, without fail, you'll have a percentage of the population that turns to fascism and strongmen as a kind of way to desperately try and get out of the situation that they're in. And people like Jair Bolsonaro, Trump, Putin, they all use that uncertainty and fear, disinformation and ignorance of the population to pat them on the back while they're stabbing them, and or that's I fucked up that analogy, to shake their hand while they're stabbing them in the back, basically. You know what I mean? Promise all these things to only a certain portion of the population who feels left behind while fucking over everybody in the process, you know? The Bolsonaro storm was only possible because of Lula's arrest in 2018, which shattered the long-standing balance between the center-left PT and the center-right PSDP that had existed since the 1990s. As Lula sat in jail during the run-up to that year's election, the left electorate split three ways between Haddad, Lula's hastily anointed successor, the pragmatist center-left figure Ciro Gomes, and the decidedly socialist Guilherme Boulos. So like I said, divide and conquer, man. That's what the right is really freaking good at, dude. Much has changed in the past 4 years. Bolsonaro has virtually no legislative achievements to boast about. Bolsonaro and his neoliberal treasury minister, Paulo Guedes, whose control of the government agenda resembles that of an Ottoman Grand Vizier, has been guilty of serious economic mismanagement. This has combined with a negligent, denialist response to the COVID-19 crisis to undermine public confidence in his administration. Following his disastrous handling of the pandemic, the president has been relying more and more on high-ranking military officers to lead government ministries. Treasury Minister Guedes is the last one left of his original cabinet. His vice president, the Army General Hamilton Mourão, fell out with Bolsonaro, who replaced him on the presidential ticket with a former Minister of Defense, General Braga Neto. Amid such instability, Lula has appeared as a phoenix rising from the ashes. Yeah, I mean, that's right out of the fascist playbook, man. As soon as they feel their grip of power slipping, they try to shore up the military and get the military on their side. So if they don't win their elections and maintain power, it makes it easier to subvert the will of the people because they have the monopoly on violence. All right. So now we're going to get into how Jair Bolsonaro has tried and continues to try to undermine the elections in Brazil. Much like Donald Trump falsely claiming that he would have won the popular vote had undocumented immigrants not been allowed to vote in 2016, Bolsonaro alleged that his victory in 2018 would have come in the first round were it not for supposed irregularities. And before I continue, so he won because he got Lula arrested. Think about that. That's fucking insane, and that is not democracy. Through multiple national and international electoral bodies, though multiple national and international electoral bodies have declared Brazil's voting machine secure time and time again, Bolsonaro continues to contend that voting with electronic machines only is unsafe, and that paper ballots are the sole way to ensure transparency. On more than one occasion, he has ordered the armed forces to inspect electronic voting machines, albeit to no avail. Again, like I said, trying to shore up the military to have a firmer grip on power. This year, such unfounded accusations have continued to grow to the point of dominating Bolsonaro's political discourse. Bolsonaro's constant threats to democracy have placed him firmly against the nation's judiciary, whose chief justices have, with few exceptions, all taken turns criticizing the president's slew of public statements expressing authoritarian intent. Now, this shit is fucking crazy, man. Like, he's just straight up mask off being like, yep, I'm a fascist. Come join me. Fuck democracy. In August, Bolsonaro organized a special gala for the embalmed heart of Dom Pedro I, very fucking creepy, the first emperor of Brazil who proclaimed the country's independence in 1822. Pedro I died in Portugal in 1834. The rest of his body was transferred to Brazil in 1972, but his heart was kept separately in a church in Porto, where it will be returned after the bicentennial. Back in 1824, Pedro dissolved the Constitutional Assembly, tasked with producing a new constitution for independent Brazil. The document, in Pedro's eyes, excessively constrained his executive powers, so he scrapped it, exiled some of the opposition, and wrote his own constitution. In a recent interview, right. Yeah, before I get down there, I wanted to also bring up where basically Bolsonaro's kind of parroting and calling back towards those days of extreme militarization and kind of nationalistic fervor with military parades. So in this article by CNN, written by Marcia Reverdosa and Rodrigo Pedroso, reporting with Camila Rocha, as Brazil's military rolls out the tanks for Independence Day, Bolsonaro tells fans to make a stand. Listen to the insane freaking shit that he says, man. Along with First Lady Michelle Bolsonaro, the president attended a military parade in the capital of Brasilia on Wednesday morning, greeting large crowds of supporters as the pair rode in a vintage Rolls-Royce convertible before the beginning of the event. Already with the fascist iconography with the Rolls-Royce. The Brazilian people today are taking to the streets to celebrate 20 years of independence and eternity freedom. What is at stake is our freedom and our future. The population knows that this is the one that guides our decision, Bolsonaro said in an interview with the Brazilian state television channel ahead of the parade. I call on you on September 7th to take to the streets for the last time. All of you here have sworn to give your life for freedom. Repeat with me. I swear to give my life for freedom, Bolsonaro said as he accepted the Liberal Party's presidential nomination on July 23rd. That is fucking insane, man. He's trying to rile up all the brown shirts and make it so that he has a group of the population who is willing to subvert democracy and fight and kill to keep him in power. It is truly freaking insane, man. So let's get to the end of this little section of the article. In a recent interview, Bolsonaro once again claimed that he will accept the outcome of the election only if it is honest and transparent, a form of doublespeak like that of Donald Trump. The allegation of fraud, the most likely pretext for a self-coup attempt, depends on how successfully Bolsonaro can sow doubt in the democratic process. If he can succeed in this task, he would then need the military support to accomplish an undemocratic seizure of power. So there you go, folks. I mean, Trump and the United States' attitude towards Latin America in the past have really laid the groundwork for this kind of fascist takeover. You know what I mean? Bolsonaro is kind of just doing what the CIA had instructed his predecessors to do, man. You know? Like I said, trying to shore up the military by appointing members of his cabinet and members of the government, having military members appointed to those positions, trying to stir up those nationalist, fascist-minded individuals within the country to try and subvert the election. He knows that he hasn't done anything to actually help the common person, and they're starting to see through his shtick, much like we have a subsection of Republicans who are starting to see through Trump's shtick, although here we have a more dangerous fascist who's, in my opinion, is probably going to get the nomination here during the presidential election, Ron DeSantis. Anyway, he's trying to make sure that he holds on to power no matter what, man. It's truly scary. I'm not sure that it'll work. It's just more likely to work in places like Latin America because they just have a history of, what do you say? LOL, still more sane than several generations of people that mutilate their own genitals because they don't understand or accept biology and believe that theft of socialism is fine. LOL, a society based on national is still better than a nation divided by racist and bigoted ideals of identity politics. Dude, that is just such fucking projection, bro. Like, are you serious? Several generations of people that mutilate their own genitals, man. Like, first of all, just let people do what the fuck they want to do, bro. What does it have to do with you, man? It literally has nothing to do with you at all, man. And a society based on nationalism is a definition of racism and bigotry, bro. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? You seriously need to read a book or something, man. I'm gonna pray for you, bro. Like, for real, man. Like, the world does not need to be divided into these little tribal sections of, oh my god, this is mine, fuck you. It makes no sense, and that's why the world is so fucked right now, man. Think about the fact that we have huge, hostile, aggressive, imperialist countries with weapons of mass fucking destruction, dude. And any moment we get someone who is just a little bit more aggressive than Putin, it could literally spell the end of fucking civilization. And this is all because of profiteering and power politics, man. Come on. Nationalism is nothing about racism, fool. It's about geography, Einstein. Bro, read a book. I'm begging you, man. Nationalism is literally the definition of racism, bro. LOL, your shtick is played out and done. Bro, if it's true, it's gonna keep on being said, man. You are literally just the person in Germany who would be like, yeah, well, we just need to keep Germany strong and keep it pure. Like, that's literally just what you're saying without being explicit about it, bro. Like, for real. Like, come on, man. I know you can do better than that. No hate, bro. I want everybody to get educated and everybody to try to work for the common good of mankind. It's as simple as that, man. You're just brainwashed by the propaganda, unfortunately, bro, and I'm sorry about that. But shit, man, let's fucking get back into this article. Or we're actually done with this one. What do we have next?